Okay, y'all, we're gonna get started. So, like always, we're gonna go over some announcements. A3 has been released. We released it yesterday. It is due next Tuesday. Just a midpoint submission. As a reminder, this midpoint submission is for completion. So please make sure you go up to the midpoint submission and then submit that. Please try not to procrastinate. It is a longer assignment because it's over 2 weeks. Um, but personally, I think it's a bit less work than A2, mainly because A2 has been, just like your first time actually creating an application with UIKit. But now that you have a little bit more experience with that, A3 should be a lot more doable. Um, okay. So now just to recap what we've learned last lecture, we introduced one way to make a scrollable view using a UI table view. And so when you create this UI table view, you make sure you want to follow these steps. You first want to create a UI table view cell. And so a cell would just be that one row that we mentioned. So in last lecture, we had like a bird table view cell in which each row contained the bird image as well as the bird name. So that one row represents a table view cell. So you first create that table view cell, and then remember, we want to constrain it based on content view, not view. So in A2, you constrain your views relative to view, which was the view controller's main view. However, when you're creating a table view cell, you want to constrain it relative to content view, which represents the view of that cell. Okay, so once you create your UI table view cell, next up is to actually create that table view. And so when you create that table view, you first want to register the cell. When you register the cell, you need to provide it with a reuse identifier, which is used to identify cells that are needed to be dequeued. Once you do that, you then set the table view's delegate. Once you set the delegate, you will need to set the table view's data source. And now when you set the delegate and the data source equal to self, you're basically telling the table view who who is conforming to the delegate and the data source protocols. So what we did was that we created an extension of our view controller class and then conformed it to the delegate and the data source protocols. And then when we conform to it, there are some functions that we implemented, such as self-row ats, as well as number of rows in section, and then the height for row ats. Okay, are there any questions about table views? Okay, it will make a lot more sense after today's lecture, because today's lecture we're going to go over a UI collection view, which is essentially the same thing as a table view. Like the way you code it is very, very similar to that of a table view. The only difference is kind of like its functionality. For A3 though, and A4, we will be using a collection view over a table view, mainly because a collection view is more powerful. But everything you've learned in the table view lecture can be translated into this lecture. Okay.
All right, so let's jump right in. So today, like Ben mentioned earlier, we're going to cover the UI collection view, which you can sort of kind of think of this as like an iteration of Monday's lecture, which was the table view. So the collection view is essentially pretty much the same as the table view here. You take some sort of model that you want, and you have an array or a set of that model object, and you want to sort of display that in a view here. So you see here in Spotify, like the image last time we showed was of a table view in Spotify, where it sort of showed all of the music that you played as a list that was a vertical scroll column. However, in this case, with the UI collection view, you could see that the UI is a lot more complicated here. So if you've used this screen on Spotify before, you know that it can vertical scroll as well as horizontal scroll. So here is an example of a collection view. And in this case, you can actually sort of nest collection views, where you have a collection view inside another that one allows you to vertical scroll and one allows you to horizontal scroll. So as you can see, sort of these setup and even the idea of the collection view is a lot more complex as well as more flexible in terms of allowing us to lay out our views in different ways. So right here, we sort of have like in Instagram as well, we have this example of a sort of grid layout. Whereas before with the table view, we only had one column, and we can only scroll vertically. However, with the collection view, we open up to a lot more sort of creative freedom, because we're allowed to now create our own flexible layout, as well as scroll both horizontally and vertically. So if you see here, yeah, this is a grid layout, but there's also like many different kinds of layouts that you can do. You can even do a circular layout, which is even more complex, or you can even sort of create your own dynamic layout. So that's sort of why a collection view is a lot more powerful than the table view, is because it sort of gives you more flexibility to build your own UI. So like a table view, sort of the items or the sort of cells are organized by items. So instead of sections and rows in a table view, a collection view is ordered by items. So if you see here, we have sort of many different items displayed in this grid view. So this is item 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So rather than having sections and rows, a collection view actually only just has items. And in this case, you can configure the layout of those items to be grid or sort of any sort of flexible layout that you want. So in terms of the setup of the collection view, you'll sort of see that in the demo later that it's basically identical to the UI table view cell, except just when actually configuring the cell itself, it's very similar. However, the collection view, when you're configuring that, it's a lot more complicated, which I guess makes sense since you have a lot more freedom to build UI with it. So basically, setting up a UI collection view cell is basically identical to the UI table view cell. So as before, you sort of have to define an initializer, like we did last class. However, the initializer is slightly different. But everything else about creating the cell is exactly the same. So you still need to dequeue the cell in order to use it, and you still want to use a reuse identifier. So this demo that's going to come later is only going to cover setting up a collection view itself. We won't actually go over how to set up a UI collection view cell because it's more or less the same thing as a UI table view cell, just that one difference with the initializer being slightly different. You would just override a different initializer. So if you want more information about this, there's a whole section on the course textbook about how to set up a collection view as well. It's literally the same thing as the demo we covered on Monday. So if you sort of got that, you should be able to get setting up the cell for a collection view as well. So I guess we can move to Vin for setting up the actual collection view itself.
Yeah, so if you haven't already, please make sure you clone the repository, unless you want to just listen and then follow along. So if you go to the course website, then you are able to see the clone link. I'll give y'all a couple of seconds to do that.
I guess also in the meantime, does anyone have any questions before we jump into the demo?
Okay, so we're gonna create a collection view here instead of a table view. Now you can notice the difference already with the collection view versus the table view. Now if you look at this bird right here, this collection view of birds, in the table view demo that we showed, each bird and each name was represented by one row. But now here with the collection view, we can create even more flexible layouts. We have two cells in each row now. Instead of one cell in each row, so it allows you to make even more flexible layouts. This isn't horizontal scrollable though. It's still vertical, but then again, if we wanted it to be horizontal scrollable, it would be really easy to do. So that's like the main difference between a collection view versus a table view. So now you may be wondering, why would I use a collection or a table view instead of a collection view? It actually depends because there are some, I guess, functionality provided by UIKit that makes table views a lot easier to use. For example, you can swipe right to delete a cell or something. Functionality like that is more built into a table view, whereas a collection view, that stuff like that isn't really built in. But then usually for this class, we mainly want y'all to use collection views because it's a lot more powerful. Okay, so our demo today is going to be creating this type of collection view. So now before we actually create the collection view, we first want to figure out how do we want to create the cell. Now, as you can see, each cell is represented by this. So this right here is one cell. So now if you take a look at the cell, what we did was basically the image, we centered that in the X anchor. We also centered the label, the name label, in the X anchor. So the name label and the image, center that with center X. But then what about the height? Well, you can honestly center the Y as well for the image. and then have this label's top anchor equal to the bottom anchor of the image, and then add some kind of padding to it. So that's like kind of the general idea of how we create the cell. So whenever you see this kind of thing on the assignments, just make sure take a look at it and see how are you going to create that table, the cell for it. So now if we look at the code, let's take a look at bird collection view cell. So then again, we have two properties, one representing each view. We have a bird image, which is a UI image view, and then the name label, which is a UI label. Now, just like before, we have setup functions. Now, these setup functions are called inside of the initializer, which means that whenever we create this UI, whenever we initialize this collection view cell object, these functions will be called. And so now we configure the views, configure its properties. Same thing, we conform it with, or we add it to the content view, and then we do this thing to enable auto layout, and then we just constrain it. So we constrain the center X, we constrain the center Y, and then again with images, you always want to give it a width and a height. So we gave it a width and a height of 128. Okay, so now that represents this thing right here. Now what about the name? Okay, well the name, we give it a text color and the fonts, and then we add it to the sub view of content view, and then enable auto layout. And now we again center the X anchor, and then make the top anchor of the name label, constrain that to the bottom anchor of the image. So this top anchor will be constrained to the bottom with a padding of 4. All right, does that kind of make sense? How do you create views and stuff? Same thing that you've been doing before. Okay. Now, the one thing that I want to highlight whenever you're creating a collection view cell is that the init function is actually different. So first, remember you're using a UI collection view cell instead of table view cell. And so automatically, when you conform to, or whenever you are creating a subclass of this, the init function will be slightly different. So the table view cell or the collection view cell, its init function will have frame as a parameter. Normally for a table view cell, it was, there was one called like a reuse identifier. But now we don't have that, we just have a frame. Don't ask me why, I actually don't know why they did that, I don't know why it's different, but that's just how it is. So remember, we create an init with this thing, you call the super initializer, and then you call your setup functions. So now if we take a look at the view controller class, just like a table view cell, we have our model, right? So we're still following MVC here. We have our model that represents our list of birds, our array of birds that we want. So an array of birds is has a bunch of bird objects in it. And so what we did in the table view lecture was that we tried to each row pass in the name and then pass in the image to the table view cell. So we're going to kind of follow the same thing, right? So let's first remember in that lecture slide how I talked about setting up a table view cell. You created the cell, and then you make sure you use content view. We already did that for you, but now let's follow these last 3 steps. First, you want to register the cell. So in order to register the cell for a collection view, we actually need to create the collection view first. So we want to do private let's collection view. You want to give it a type of UI collection view. Now, if I try to do this, it's giving me an error. It's saying that class view controller has no initializers. Now, when I did this with the table view, it didn't give me an error. That's because the table view could be nil, or that table view did not have a default value or initializer for it. Whereas a UI collection view, whenever you create it, you need to initialize it. That's why it's saying that this view controller class has no initializers, because it needs to initialize a UI collection view. So you may be wondering, like, what do we need to initialize inside of a UI collection view? So that's the thing. You have to create this thing called a flow layout. So that's like one of the main differences between a table view and a collection view. You have to define a flow layout. So now, to silence this error, I'm going to use an exclamation point here. This is called, I forgot what it's called. It's called like implicit, I forgot what it's called, but you're basically saying that, okay, I need to make this a var. Yeah, you have to make it a var because you're going to be changing this property later. So make it a var. But by adding this exclamation point, it's just basically making a promise that I will assign this an initial value. I could have used a question mark here, but the difference is that whenever I call this CollectionView property, it's going to automatically make it a non-optional. So if I make this an optional, then every time I use CollectionView, it's going to think it's an optional. But by using an exclamation point, it's basically saying that CollectionView will not be an optional. Now, because this is kind of like force unwrapping, it's okay though, because you're making a promise that you're going to initialize it later. So first, we're going to initialize that collection view. So then again, it is some kind of view, so you want to create some kind of setup function for it. So I'm going to do setup collection view, and then call that function right here. Private func setup collection view. Okay, so first you want to create a flow layout for it. So I'm going to say let flow layout be equal to a UI collection view flow layout. Okay, so I create a flow layout. Now there are a couple of things that you want to configure in your flow layouts. And so if I do flow layouts, if I hit dots, one thing that I want to implement will be the scroll direction. So then again, if I hit equals and hit dot, you can see that it gives me two options, horizontal or vertical. So in this case, I want to make this thing vertical. So this entire collection view will have a vertical scroll direction. Now, notice how this collection view right here has like some spacing in between the cells. So you can configure that with a flow layout. So to do that, you want to do flow layout dot minimum line spacing. So that's used in between the lines. And then you can provide it with some kind of, constant value, let's say 16. And then you also want to do the inter item spacing and then set that equal to 16 as well. So now basically what I'm doing is that I'm adding a spacing between here and here with 16. To be honest, I don't remember which one was for like the top or bottom, or which one's top.
So I believe the actual interline spacing is, if you go back to the, you see here in the collection view here, if you see the spacing between the rows, that is actually the interline between the minimum line spacing. Whereas the inter-item spacing is the spacing between each item in that row. So minimum line spacing specifies, how much space you want each line of your collection view, or in other words, each row. However, the minimum inter-item spacing specifies the spacing between each item in that row.
Okay, so now we created a flow layout now. Now remember, we made a promise to this view controller that we're going to initialize it with some kind of value. And so what I'm going to do is that collection view property that I created up here, I'm now going to initialize it now. So that's going to be equal to a UI collection view. Okay, and now you want to pass in a frame as well as a collection view layout. Now usually for frame, you want to pass in some kind of CG rect. Normally we just use .0 because we're going to be using auto layout to kind of constrain it. And then you want to pass in the flow layouts. So I'm going to pass in flow layout here. Okay. Now notice every time I use collection view here, it doesn't make it an optional. Whereas if I put a question mark here, for example, and then I try doing collection view, it's now an optional now. But you don't want, I guess you could do that, but it's like very, very annoying. Okay. So now just like before, you also want to set the delegate as well as the data source. And so to do that, first you want to set up the register the cell first. So you want to do collection view dot register. And now you want to use this one right here. So we first pass in the class of the cell. In this case, it was a bird collection view cell. So we want to type in bird collection view cell. Now remember, to actually get the type of that, you want to use .self to get the actual type of it. Now we want to pass in a reuse identifier, same thing we've done before. So now if we look at this collection view cell class, I created a static variable called reuse. Remember, this can be whatever string you want, but it's just convention to call it like this. So now to access this variable, all I can do is just do bird collection view cell dot reuse. So now that I've registered the cell, next up is to create or conform to the delegates and the data source. So you can do CollectionView.delegate, set that equal to self, and then CollectionView.dataSource, also set that equal to self. Okay. So now, again, it's giving me these errors because whenever you're putting self to the delegate, that means that you have to conform to the protocols. So like always, we always create extension. Now notice the extension is outside of the class. So I'm gonna create an extension of the name of the class, so view controller, and then it's gonna conform to the collection view delegates, UI collection view delegate. Okay. Now the function that you want to implement inside of so the delegate actually has okay, actually I lied. There's in the collection view delegate, there's actually some functions that you don't really need to implement at all. I know in the table view, I think it was it the height? I can't remember. Yeah, I think the delegate, you provided a height, but because we're using a collection view now, you don't need to provide a height. And so this thing you actually really don't need. I think there is a function called did select item at. So that's the one thing that you want to do if you want to select into it. However, for this example, we're not really doing anything like that. So we can kind of just like omit this. But we still want to like do this though, because you need to conform to it. So now with that, you also want to do the data source. So you can do extension view controller. Now you want to do UI collection view data source. Now data source, it will provide you protocol stubs. So fill that in, and then fill this in. So these are the two required functions provided by this protocol right here that we have to implement. Okay. Now, notice how this says number of items instead of number of rows. So when you're using a collection view, the terminology for each, cell is called an item, whereas a table view, it's called a row. So remember this distinction. So now just like before, number of items in section, well, that would just be the size of the array. That's the number of cells that we want to create. So to do that, you just want to return birds.count. Okay. Now next up, cell for item at, kind of like the same thing we did before with the table view. You want to provide it a cell given this index path. Now this index path represents the, item at some position. And so to do that, you have a collection view property that you pass in, or a collection view argument that you pass in. There's a function called DQ reusable cell. Again, same thing as the table view. You DQ it. Now you need to know which cells you want to DQ. That's why we have a reuse identifier to know which cells you want to DQ. So I'm going to use bird collection view cell dot reuse. That's the reuse identifier. And then for the index path, you're just going to pass in this index path right here. Okay. Now, again, we want to return the cell for the item. So I'm going to assign that to some variable. And then I can return the cell. But then remember, same thing as before, this is a UI collection view cell. So instead of doing that, or we don't want a UI collection view cell, we want our custom class. So who can tell me what we need to do with the cell? Yes. Exactly. We need to cast it to our custom type. So to safely cast that, we use the as keyword with a question mark, and then you want to pass in bird collection view cell here. Now, honestly, you can use optional or nil coalescing to do this. But me personally, normally how we do is that we use an if let. But like low-key, this is a lot cleaner. But just for like convention's sake, we'll use an if let because we're gonna need to configure it later. So then I'm gonna unwrap it with an if let, and then return the cell inside of here because this cell is only inside of this if statement. And then by default, you need to return some kind of collection view cell. So return UI collection view cell. Now, what do I need to do here? Can someone tell me what I need to do in here? like let's take a look at the bird collection view cell class. We need to kind of customize each cell because each cell is different. Because the image is different and the name is different. And so there's a function called configure. Now we didn't mark it as private because we want to be able to call it. And so this configure method, it takes it in a bird object. Now what does it do with the bird object? It sets the image to equal to the bird image. So if you look at our model, you can see that the bird struct has an image as well as a name. So now if you look at this, you're just using the bird's image as well as the bird's name and then configuring these properties with those values. And so now if you go to the view controller, that means that we need to call this configure method. So this method is in the bird collection view cell class. So I can do cell.configure, and then I want to pass in a bird object. Now remember, we had an array of birds here. And so in order to get the bird object at that position, we would need to use this index path parameter here. So I'm going to just say let bird be equal to the bird's array. Now to get the elements at some position, you use the square brackets, and then you pass in the index path dot row. Okay, so now that gives me a bird object, and now all I'm going to do is just pass in that bird object here. Okay, so now the only thing some other things that I'm missing is that because this is some other view, I also need to constrain it to the actual main view of the view controller. So I'm just going to set the top, bottom, left, or leading and trailing anchor to the view's trailing anchor. So remember, first you want to add it as a subview to the view. So I'm going to add the collection view as a subview. And then I'm also going to set this thing to false so I can enable auto layout. And now I'm going to use NS layouts to activate the constraints. So I'm just going to be really simple and then constrain all 4 anchors into the view's anchors. So I can say view or collection view, set its leading anchor, constrain that equal to the view's leading anchor. I also want to do the same thing with the trailing anchor, constrain that to the view's trailing anchor. Same thing with the top anchor, view.top anchor. And we want to use .top anchor instead of .safe area layout because we want it to be at like the very, very top. And then last but not least, we want to constrain the bottom anchor to the view's bottom anchor. Okay. And I call this function here. You have a question?
Where exactly does the top anchor go? Does it go to right under the birds, or does it go all the way up past?
So the top anchor goes beyond the safe area layout is anything that you can click. So the very top anchor would actually be the top of the phone itself.
Yeah, even though it doesn't seem like it's actually, I guess, at the very top, but that's because this has you're putting it inside of a navigation controller. So this is inside some kind of navigation stack, and so that's why there's this navigation title for it right there.
Right. So those are essentially 2 views. You have the navigation view on top, and you have your base view on the bottom, which is what you usually add your views to. So you don't actually want to conflict those. So that's why you sort of add it to the top, which is the bottom of essentially the navigation bar.
Yeah. So now let me try to run this and see if our collection view will show up. Okay, so it does show up, but it looks very weird. Now, what is the issue here? Well, that's because there's also one more thing that we need to do. We need to conform to a delegate flow layout. That's how we kind of, I guess, configure the size of the collection view. Now, notice how in the table view, we had a height for row ads. We kind of need the same thing before a collection view. So, you create an extension as always, extension of the view controller class, conform that to UICollectionView delegate flow layouts. Now, there's one function that isn't required but you should implement, and that's called size for item ats. So type in size for item ats, and then that gives you this function. Now, notice how this function returns a CG size. So let's take a look at what the CG size object takes in. So it has a width and a height. So you can see that I'm passing in some kind of size or some kind of width and some kind of height to each cell. So now what I want to do is make it into, I guess, 2 columns. So you can see that the width and the height are kind of like the same. So now how do I know how much to set the width equal to? So you can do some kind of like neat trick. So you can see that the width of each cell is the entire width of the screen divided by 2 minus some kind of padding. So that's kind of like a neat trick to see how many columns that you want to do. So if I wanted 3 columns, I would then divide that by 3, and then subtract with some padding to make it a little bit smaller. So that's what I'm going to do. So to get the size of the screen, you can do frame, or it's CollectionView dot frame. So this is the size of the collection view. Dot width. So that gives you the width of it. And then you want to divide it by some constant. Let's say divide that by 2. And then there was some padding in between of 16. So I'm just going to subtract 16. That way the width isn't actually like full on this. There's still some padding to it. So I'm just going to subtract 16. And now I'm going to just save that to some constant. I'm going to say let's width be equal to this. I'll just use size actually. Okay. So now I want to return a CG size. So now the width would be size, and then the height would still be size as well. Okay. So now let me try to run this and see if this works. So yeah, as you can see, everything's scrollable and it looks exactly like how we want to do it. Yes.
Okay, so for the size thing that we just did, when you minus 16 for the padding, why does it make it so that the 2, like for each row, it goes onto the sides? Like, why doesn't it just clamp it onto like 2 on the left side and 16 on the right?
That's mainly because, so this function right here only determines the size for like the entire cell. Now, the reason was because we centered each view in the center X. So that's why it looks very symmetric. But then when we subtract the 16, like if I remove the 16, then there could be a chance in which there would only be 1 column. That's because each cell would be too big, and so it would try to make everything in 1 column, like that. So we want to squish it a little to make it into 2 columns. And the reason for that was because whenever we created the collection view cell, we added like a padding of like 16. So honestly, this number is kind of just like play around with it and see which value works. Now the problem with this is that sometimes you have different screen sizes. That's why we want to use .frame.width so that it works with different screen sizes as well.
Also, if you're wondering about why there's a space in the middle rather than having a space at the end, it's because we sort of set that property earlier in the flow layout. In the flow layout from before, where remember the inter-item spacing was 16, right? So that specifies the spacing regardless of what you specify the size to be. That's why if you set it to half of the width of the entire screen, it's still going to try to add that spacing, and you're going to push that second view to the second line.
So the reason why there was only, like when you got rid of the minus 16, it only had 1 element per row is because of
that inter-item spacing. It still adds that to the end of each item, but you can't fit the next item anymore because it's exactly half the width in that case.
Yeah, I didn't mean, I think I said collection view cell on accident. What I meant was the inter-item spacing was 16, so the padding in between each one. Okay, so now everything works. Well, if this was 16, then it would work. Honestly, you can play around with it. If I, divide this by 3, try running that, then it might still be 2. But then, if you do like minus 16,
minus 32,
or 32,
because there's 2 spaces now in each row. Now you want 32 spacing.
Yeah, honestly, you just got to play around with it and see like which values you want. So now it should be 3 now. But then again, the name is a little like cut off because of how we did it. Because this is 16 right here. Okay. So just to, I guess, quickly recap the main differences between a collection view and then a table view. The init function is slightly different. So if we look back at the code, the init function of a collection view cell uses the frame, or okay, I don't know why it's okay, I don't know. Okay.
That's still the view controller.
Yeah, okay, my Xcode is bugging. I don't know why it's using the view controller when I'm selecting collection view cell.
Try clicking this out again.
Okay, whatever. So notice how the init function is a little bit different. So it uses the frame instead of the reuse identifier. So that's one thing. The other thing is that we use UICollectionView cell here instead of table view cell. So I pointed that out. And then now when we initialize it, remember you want to make this a var because you're going to configure it later. And then we use this exclamation mark right here. And then when we call it in view did load, we create a flow layout first. That's another key difference. And then we pass it into this thing when we initialize it. Okay. And then you also want to conform to this protocol right here, and then implement the size for row at function, or size for item at function. And then again, the terminology is items instead of rows. Okay. Are there any questions about collection views versus table views? Okay, we're gonna move on to the Kahoot for today. We don't profit from videos. We don't profit from videos. But the numbers are going around. All right, we're gonna get started. First question. True or false? When we create a table view, our views should be constrained relative to the view instead of content view. Yeah, so the answer is false. Remember, the table view cell represents that one row, and then every view that we create in there, we want to constrain that relative to content view. View is only reserved for the view controller. Okay.
All right, next question. Multi-select this time. This is multiple answers. Which of the following functions should we implement when we're creating our table view? So yeah, this last green one was a play on cell for row at. So basically, when we create a table view in our delegate and our data source, We need to define the cell for row at, the number of rows in the section, as well as the height for row at. Table view for cell at does not exist. Okay, let's see. Oh.
When we dequeue cells, only cells that are on the screen are allocated for memory. Yeah, so the answer is true. We dequeue cells to save memory because each cell we only want to allocate memory if it's on the screen. Okay. Nice, good job. Okay, we still have some time left, so while y'all are I guess packing up, I want to quickly go over a bit about A3. The TODOs are basically the same thing as the announcements, but if we take a look at A3, so up to the midpoint submission, you're going to be using a collection view to create this kind of side chat alternative. Yeah, this is just, I randomly went on side chat during the summer, and then I just chose this, but anyways, so yeah, that's the collection view that you have to create. So we do provide y'all with hard-coded data to get started with, to kind of create this, and then we'll kind of teach y'all how to actually integrate networking by actually communicating with an actual backend service, so that you can have your own side chat. One thing to mention is that this view up here has already been created for you, just this top view. A good thing, or one thing that we want to teach you about this course, is being able to look at code that people have written already and be able to build on top of that. So what we did was that we created this table view or this text view for y'all, and then your task will be to actually populate the backend with whatever you pass in. So then next week's lecture is going to be probably the most important lectures that we're going to be teaching y'all. So it's actually how to kind of integrate with your backend and how to actually make your app come to life. So yeah, that's it. If y'all have any questions about A2 or something, then feel free to come up.